Greetings, everybody. My name is Carl Fuerstman. I'm 60 years old, and I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. Message to David and Rick. I truly do appreciate the efforts that you guys made to show a tribute to my friends George Shaw and John Willhelm, and even though I apologize for my reluctance to originally get involved with it, I'm sending something for the sake of something you might be able to use, as well as something that Stephanie and Tom and Jeff and Eric Willhelm and families and Barbara Shaw, George's sister, can all see a little bit of, maybe. So let's go back to 1969. I was at Smith Junior High School. I was a 9th grader. I was young, I was impressionable, and I was stupid. But one day, I had a friend named Richard Nagel who I grew up with. His family and my family all kept up with each other for Passover and the High Holy Days and things like that. Richard was a great guy. He's gone now, and I miss him. Anyway, Richard went to East Mecklenburg High School when I moved on to South Mecklenburg. But before that happened, one day I was at Freedom Park with my brother. This is in '69, who had just gotten out of his tour in Vietnam. And he had this beautiful Ariana guitar. And on Sunday afternoons, about the only thing to do back then was to go over to Freedom Park and hang out with all the other hippies. And I used to go with my big brother, and we would go over there and he would play the guitar and we would sing Crosby, Stills and Nash and folk songs and Peter, Paul and Mary and all that stuff. And this guy walks up while Leland's playing, my brother's Leland, and he walks up and he's got another guy, and that was George Shaw and David Fair. And George is a strange guy. He's got this army jacket on, not like a fatigue jacket, but kind of like an army dress jacket. And he's got ironed hair. His hair is straight as an arrow. And he says to Leland, "Can I play your guitar?" And Leland's kind of reluctant to give it to him, but he turns around and he says, "Okay." And George takes the guitar and flips it over and starts playing it left-handed without doing anything at all. And he's not just playing, he's wailing. I mean, at least from my impressionable 15 years old, that's what it looked like to me. And Leland was impressed, and he was the guitar player among the two of us. And that was my first meeting with George. It came to be known that George was also at East Mecklenburg High School, which was not my high school. And my friend Richard Nagel had another friend named Steve Province who was a drummer. And one day I was in a situation where I was made events coordinator for the 9th grade prom at Smith Junior High School. And I needed a band, and I didn't have a band of value at that time myself, because I wasn't really doing anything with bands yet. And so I called Richard and I said, "Can your buddy Steve Province get his band to play?" They were called Flight. "Get his band to play at my junior high prom." And they said, "Sure." So I think we had to requisition $150 for the band to play, and I felt like a real concert promoter. But I got on the phone and they told me to call George Shaw, which at the time I still didn't remember his name from the Freedom Park incident. But I called George and we chatted, and he said, "You know who I am?" And I said, "Who's that?" And then he told me about the Freedom Park thing. And so they played the party, and we had a connection because George liked one of the girls that I went to junior high school with. George was 2 years older than me. And excuse me. And he had a great way with women, and so I was the liaison between one of the girls at my junior high school and George for a while, but that's another story. Nevertheless, it bonded us even more. George wound up, got to think about it, they played the party. In the midst of this, George and Richard Nagel and I kind of started bonding because Richard and George went to high school together. And we stayed at Richard's house one night, and we all walked about 8 miles to this club called Phantasmagoria in Matthews, North Carolina. And we had a wonderful adventure. I'm sure there was some weed involved, and we had a great time going all the way over to this crazy club that was kind of back during the psychedelic days. And we actually hung out there, met a girl named Madonna. This is before Madonna, who was a singer. And then that night when we finally worked our way back to Richard's parents' house, we all went down in Richard's basement, and Richard and George and I sat at the piano. He had a big old upright piano in there, and we started plinking on the piano, and George heard that I could play these songs from the Spirit album. Remember the Spirit album, I've Got a Line on You and all that stuff? There were some songs that I knew the piano licks to, and George was really impressed that I could play those piano licks. And finally I said, oh, I'm making a mark with George. And I think Mr. Nagel walked down while the three of us were sitting in our jockey shorts on the piano bench. But he kind of looked at us like, what the hell? Anyway, I miss all of the Nagels. And I got to where George and I started bonding. And in order for me to visit him, I would have to go from my side of town to his side of town. Me not driving, Mom had to do that. And we'd hang out at George's house, and in the basement, his mother, Mary Todd, was truly a brilliant artist. Kind of quirky back then, but I certainly came to realize how great she was. But you'd walk into this house, and she had so much good stuff, and she had, besides painting, she developed boxes and frames and did all the work herself. And she had this one sideline where she made postal prints. I mean, she could put your face in a stamp and make it look like you were right part of a letter in an envelope. And he just great stuff. And she had a hearing deficit and which caused a speech impediment, but she loved George. She loved all of George's friends, had a bunch of poodles running around the house, and I got to meet George's sister, Barbara, who at the time was a photographer. Barbara, are you still a photographer? I hope you are. And I knew that you lived in Greensboro for a while, and so I didn't get to see you much. But in the meantime, George and I started bonding, and we worked downstairs, and it's amidst his mother's workshop where she had saws and amongst the canvas and wood and everything else. Crazy things. She brewed her own beer, and we tried to put a band together, and we decided that we were going to play the Sunday afternoon at Phantasmagoria, where they would let kind of like a jams, where one band would get up for 5 songs and another band would get up for 5 songs, and we had to put the songs together, and we did. And George actually finagled a music store into loaning us an electric piano. I don't know how he did that. I always have to pay for them. And we went to Phantasmagoria, and we started playing it. Melvin Cohen used to be the music guy at Phantasmagoria. He might have been one of the owners. And am I rambling, Bob? Melvin Cohen used to be one of the owners, and he kind of coordinated that whole effort. And we got up there and we did our songs by Spirit, and George did Baby I'm Gonna Leave You by Led Zeppelin, and we did some songs like that. And somewhere along the way, Melvin decided he'd heard enough, and he actually literally pulled the plug on us. And George was incensed. He couldn't believe that we got cut off in the middle of a song, which we did. And scrawny little George got up in big fat Melvin's face, screaming at the top of his lungs. And Melvin might not have beat him up, but he had a bunch of guys around that could. And they didn't let us go back to play, but I'll never forget how George looked when he was doing that. And so in the course of that time, we tried to do some more bands, but we were always friends. We were always doing adventures together. I would go stay at his house. We'd spend the night and we'd sneak his mother's car out and drive all over Charlotte. And this was at the beginning of puberty, so I was trying to get laid, and the first person I met to get laid was that girl that I met out at Phantasmagoria, and she actually stayed with us one night at George's house when his mother was out of town, and we tried to verbally beat each other up to decide which one of us might have an opportunity to do what neither one of us wound up doing. But I could still remember him trying to get the best of me in some sort of verbal exchange. All right. As we went on, George started impressing a lot of people, and this was back during the age when everybody needed to have big amps. And George was constantly trying to get his mother to get him a big Ampeg Colossus, one of these tall amps. And, none of us had any money other than what we could finagle out of our parents for whatever instruments we had. I had a Farfisa Fast 4 organ. And during this period, George started telling me about this guy, John Willhelm. I said, I don't know. He goes to East, too. All these guys, it was like I was at South, they were at East. The grass was always greener to me over at East. I found a lot more artistically oriented guys over there and was having a good time. They were all richer than me too. But I went to, I kept telling George, I don't care about your friend John, that's your life, why are you bringing him in? I thought we were doing fine. And I come to meet John, and he's a good old Ohio boy. His family they're all from Dayton, Centerville, and total family. I don't think I've ever seen a family that was so close. Every night, or a lot of nights, they would all pop some popcorn and sit out in front of the TV together. I mean, all of them. And there was Jeff and Tom and Stephanie and Eric, who all came after John. And so there were 5 children, and they had wonderful family adventures, and their parents were as perfectly oriented as possible. I loved Carolyn Willhelm, and I loved Louis Willhelm. And they treated me like family. And the next thing I knew, I liked being around John more than I liked being around George, because George was volatile. George was the kind of person that if you didn't do it George's way, then he was going to keep reminding you of that. And that was something that kind of Svengali-ish. He truly was a brilliant talent, but I knew there was no chance that I could catch up to that level. And so I was happy enough just to be with him and hang out with him, bond with him and do things with him, hopefully do some music. What we found out in the 3 of us was that we could all sing together, we could play things together, and we could harmonize together. And that, coming out of my family where everybody in the family could harmonize, it was such a rarity to find other people that could do it as naturally as my family did. Sure was fun though, because these guys were my friends, and gosh, it was great. So as the days went by, George suddenly had gotten an offer to join a band in Greensboro, North Carolina. We all grew up in Charlotte, and so he disappeared for a little while. And while he disappeared, John and I graduated. We were both the same age, and from high school, and came to the conclusion that we should get our first place together. And so we got an apartment at Claridge Apartments on Nations Ford Road, in a building that I think we were the only tenants in the building, because it was a brand new building. I went over to the Salvation Army and found a old baby grand Sommer piano for $150 and put it up there, and John and I were both there. And he got a job with a group called Sugar Creek. He played in different bands on and off. John was an okay drummer, but he was well-rounded musically. He had a tremendous amount of talent. You could see it. All three of us had a wonderful sense of humor when we would do music, and that was one of the great bonding parts. But suddenly, John started developing his drumming well beyond anybody that I've ever been around to watch somebody go from just a simple drummer to being so intricate and so jazz oriented and he was playing in a top 40 band and playing that music exactly right. So I mean, I watched this as we lived together, because he'd be out on the road and he'd come back. It's important to point out there was always weed around. But that's part of the whole deal. This is right. I remember seeing on TV the Watergate hearings, so that's the period of time that I'm talking about. But I was going to school in Central Piedmont and working in little bands around Charlotte, and John was on the road with Sugar Creek, and I suddenly George decides he wants to come back. Now, George's mother wouldn't let George drive until he was about 18. Whatever reason, I don't know, but George always needed somebody to come and pick him up. That irritated the shit out of me. God, always, come on, George, just get there yourself. Well, he comes back from Greensboro with his new girlfriend, Candy, and it's not just George needing to be picked up all the time. It's George and Candy, John and Yoko. And we all just, John was never like me. John was, he could deal with people so much easier than I could. I lost my temper a lot, especially with George. John, on the other hand, let things roll. And that really connected John and George a lot. And as the months went by, I probably found myself in a jealous spot. So I went out to prove myself a lot on my own, because I didn't see at that moment, I didn't see the bond that I wanted to see. But I had such a great experience with John, and I loved George and respected George, that I didn't want to be disconnected. A lot of people always think of the three of us as being together. Well, we're just like any other relationship. You got your good moments and you got your bad moments. One day we get this, I may pop back to something, but one day I'm looking at the green section in the Charlotte News. Doesn't exist anymore. And there's a story about a little blurb about a movie that's going to be shot. And the producer's name is Pat Patterson. He's a local Charlotte producer, did such great movies as Blood Feast, and crazy chain-smoking producer that lit his cigarette with the burning end of the stub he had just finished smoking. And he used to say, like my movies or not, they're all playing in drive-in theaters all over the country. So, and he had this young director named Rick Friedel, who I just understand lately was just out of film school, and probably this is one of his early projects. And he came into town, and we all of us went to audition. And my sister and George and John and I all went to some apartment. And then they called us back and to let us know that none of us got parts in the movie, but we could all work on the crew. And Pat Patterson gave a big long spiel about, you might not make any money, but you're going to get a very good education. Well, he paid us, but he just didn't pay us a lot. And I did get a good education. I know what a grip is now. And we had a good time. I was a sound engineer. George, in the meantime, who was always extremely good at being able to talk people into things, especially me, talked Rick into letting him and John do the music on this movie. And they made a deal. And the next thing I knew, George had a moviola. George and John had a moviola set up at their house. I'd never seen one of those, and they were making very funny music for this movie. Some of it was extremely serious, and then there was a song on the radio about stinking up the kitchen, a real country song, and a Bodie-O-Do song that had a crackling sound in it, like it came out of played on a 78. And John said he took a signal cable and plugged it in. It was a broken signal cable, and he just started cranking it like this, and it made all the noise of the static. And John was very proficient with an ARP 2600 synthesizer that he learned how to design sounds. And it was when I started hearing the fruits of their labor, I couldn't get over how professional it sounded. And then I thought, my God, these guys are developing a whole new career outside of performing. George was a great performer, but a lot of bands couldn't deal with a George in the band. And George kind of got bored of being in any of the bands that made money, like the top 40 bands around the Carolinas. So he would do his stint, and then sooner or later somebody would get at wit's end and say, okay, hit the road or whatever. And George, by that time, George was ready to go anyway, so he didn't care. But John, on the other hand, was the great soldier. John could do all that stuff. But when those two guys worked together, John knew exactly how to work with George. And John played guitar along with being a great drummer and a great singer. He was a guitar player, and he could pick up instruments the same way George could. I remember when George was in that Greensboro band, I saw him and they were playing a song. They were playing something like How Sweet It Is by Junior Walker or Sea Cruise, something that had a dominant saxophone part. And George actually picked up tenor sax and started playing it during that part. And I mean, this guy could pick up a violin and play it. One time, George and John and I went into a McDonald's on a Friday night after a football game, which we didn't know anything about, but the place was packed. And I had an accordion, and John had the bagpipe, not the bags, but the part that goes with the bagpipes. And George had a violin, and we were actually picking out and playing songs for these people until we got thrown out. But that's the kind of stuff that we would do. George and my sister Lenore and I also bonded very well, and Lenore, who wonderful singer, we could all harmonize together. We could do things like Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, and it was great, all the Beatles songs. That's a lot of fun. And that I miss like crazy. George and John and I one time went down to see Calvin Walker over at WRBQ in Charlotte, or WRPL. And he put us on the radio live, and we actually had just thrown together this cute little song. On September, the leaves come tumbling down. It was a great little song that we just wrote, within about an hour, where we stairwayed our way through the On Septembers with harmony. And Calvin put us on the radio. It was great. And Eric, thank you for keeping a copy of that, because now I have a copy of On September. And I think we refer to it as This Old Town, but nevertheless, it was great stuff. George and I went to Jubilee Weekend one time. Jubilee Weekend, that was at Chapel Hill, one of those places with the giant concert, bunch of bands, and along with the standard experimentations with the available partakements of that time, we actually stood at the gate and asked people for spare change. Came home with a good $30 a piece. This is back in the early 70s. And we did the one thing that I've left this out. One of the great things that George and John and I all had in common was we were all trying to outdo each other for obscure albums, and just to show that we had some real taste in music. And George turned me on to people like, well, Led Zeppelin at the time. I wasn't really a big Led Zeppelin fan. He liked another group called Love, and he also got into crazy classical like Eric Satie and Shostakovich and just John Cage, and I'd turned him on to Sun Ra, who's just as weird and destructured. And John, we all had gobs and gobs of albums that nobody else had, just to prove that we were great audiophiles at the time. And so when we came back from Chapel Hill that time, we went straight to Record City Discount in downtown Charlotte and bought 5 or 6 albums apiece. That was a wonderful experience. Toe Fat 2. Can you imagine that there's a 2? There's a 1? Anyway, lots of bands out there. So George and John did this great movie. It was called Lisa Lisa. And the music was so cool. And after it was over, things continued to go on where George put a wonderful concert together. I was mad because I didn't hear about it until one day when I overheard George talking to Linwood Sawyer on the telephone. They put the concert together. It's called Just Jazz, and it invited all the young and older bands that played jazz in Charlotte to play at Queens College on a Sunday night. And I argued and whined and said why I'm not part of it. And so George decided to let me be in his band. And then we also did songs together, songs that I wrote as well. And John was great. And it was a great concert. It was truly great. All these, Linwood pretty much promoted it all, and George lined up all the music. And we, it was great. It was great. And George and John were wonderful hosts. They got out there with these placards. One said, "Be jovial." He was trying to get people to get involved. And in the meantime, I went off to once again find myself, joined some road bands, and made different friends along the way, nothing like George and John. And while I was gone on one of the trips, before I go there, I'd like to go back to the fact that George was so recognizable with his music and so amazing. One time I took a trip by myself to New Orleans to find myself, and had a great time for 2 weeks. And George, I called him up, and he said, "John and I are coming down." And they came down for the next 2 weeks, and I took them to all the places that I had found, and we went into a jazz club, not in the Quarter, a real jazz club outside of the Quarter on Rampart Street. And there was a blind piano player, and he kicked ass. And we went into this club, and George walked right up to the guy and asked him if he could sit in. And the guy said, "Sure, I guess," And so George started playing with him, and if you had seen the reaction of this guy listening to George play, I mean, it was just amazing, just amazing. He was really taken aback, and that's the effect that George had on people. He was so far and above better than other guitar players, other musicians. He played piano way better than I ever could, and he played other instruments. I was jealous of his piano playing. Never could get up to that level of that, and he could sing. He could sing like a bird. Truly a smooth tenor voice that sounded real good when we recorded. And they spent a lot of time. They spent a lot of time in the studio, especially at a little studio down in Columbia, South Carolina, that ETV had. A guy named John Gelinas really liked what they were up to, and they started recording song after song after song, and they would always drive down US 21 because back then I-77 didn't go from Charlotte to Columbia. I'll come back to that later, but that's what they would do. They would go down to Columbia and do a lot of recording down there. And in the meantime, I was on the road playing in bands, and no, still not finished. Still not finished. Where was I? Okay. I'll come back to it if I remember it. I went out on the road with different bands, and one of the bands took me way out of town to places like Ohio. I'm in North Carolina, so we go to Ohio. And George and I had our on and off again volatility, but we never stopped being in touch. And one day I played a gig in a Holiday Inn or a Sheraton or something, and about 4 o'clock in the morning my father called me up, woke me up and told me that George and John had both been killed in the same automobile crash on US 21, this little 2-lane road that they used to go down to Columbia in the middle of the night. And it's only a 2-hour drive from Charlotte, but it was, and it's a desolate road, but that a truck hit them. Like, truck coming the other way, boom, like that. And the truck driver had this ridiculous, stupid explanation, like they were in the wrong lane, and he started flashing his lights and beeping his horn, and nobody that lives around that area, there was only a few little farmhouses, but none of those people heard any of that. And that the truck driver says just at the last second, he was trying to go in the wrong lane in order to avoid him, and suddenly they went back to the, it's so crazy. And 2 days later, the truck was fixed, so even the cops didn't have a chance to see what kind of damage was on the truck. It turned out that the truck driver had a record as long as your arm, and it turned out that the trucking company had a record for hiring those guys. So we weren't ever going to get to the end of what happened, but both John and George were killed instantly in the same automobile crash. My father called me up at 4 o'clock in the morning of that night and arranged for airfare for me to fly back from Columbus, Ohio to Charlotte. And I had to fight my way through one night more of playing before I could get the flight out, which was not easy. And then I had to tell my band, sorry, we're done here. I can't stay. And do you want me to stop? And I went back and had it was pretty surreal. I went over to the Willhelm's house, and they were all sitting around. This is a very, very close family, and they were mourning. They were in grief, and I did what I know how to do. I started telling funny stories about John and George, and by the end of the evening, everybody was laughing and carrying on and felt real good about. I felt good, I can tell you that. I love you, Willhelms. I love each and every one of you. You've always been really good to me. And the next day, I went over to Mrs. Shaw's house, and Mr. and Mrs. Shaw's house, and sat with Mrs. Shaw and did the same thing. Mary Todd was sure a great lady. We used to sneak, when I told you we used to sneak the car out, she caught us one time. Oh, anyway, I'll tell you that story another time. But the funeral was very large, and I remember sitting in the front room in a chair, and I noticed two caskets being pushed across the opening of a hallway about 25 feet away from me, and I couldn't believe it. I lost it right then and there. At that point, it was my selfishness. I lost what I thought was my life. I really didn't know what was going to happen at that point, because I remember very little of the funeral after that. And they were amazing. Both George and John were amazing. Now, in the course of this time, as I always told you before, George was a Svengali kind of a guy. He pushed me around mentally a lot. And there was a short period where my brother and I had rented a house together. And my brother had a ping pong table, and George and John started coming over, and we all played ping pong. And one time, George broke a window to get into the house. I don't know if it was George or John, but we weren't there, and they wanted to get in and play ping pong, so they broke in to get into the house. They may not inadvertently broken the window, but when Leland, my brother, got wind of it, he was very incensed. He was mad that I wasn't mad along with him, and it drove a stake between my brother and I. That's nothing new, Leland. We've always had that. And George became even more Svengali-ish, and he started telling me, it's time for you to live back near us again. And he says, why don't you move in with Joe Newland right across the porch, another East Mecklenburg graduate that had moved in. And I did, thereby driving the stake between my brother and I even further in. And Joe was living across from George and John when they died, and he had been told by Mr. Willhelm of all of this. And I try to imagine what it's like to think that this little community where Joe was living on one side and George and John were living on the other side of this porch, and he gets this news while he's by himself, knowing that it's not going to change much. And it was quite devastating. And I came back home because I was living with Joe at the time. And Joe had a tape of the latest rough stuff that John and George had been recording, a cassette. And the last song that they recorded was called Creeping Staircase. And I know that all that know George and John probably have a copy of that. But it is so eerie. It has police sirens in it, and it's when you're listening to it and you're hearing it just a few days after this terrible, terrible accident, I mean, you just can't disconnect the two. It's scary. But they have always been extremely profoundly part of my life, probably my BFFs. And John, because of his sense of humor and his talent and how capable he was of handling every situation in a smooth way, in the Willhelm way. And George, who forever would want me to practice and want to try to get more out of me. And as many times as I was irritated by some of the things that he wanted to do, I truly loved him and John. I mean, I miss them both 40 years later, and I know why you guys are doing this, and I appreciate it. I love all my friends in Charlotte. If I think of more stuff, I'll get back to you. Thanks for the time.